The Story of Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 7, Side 2. Those were the days of the love of Ming for Yang Kui Fei. Tu celebrated it like the other poets, but when revolution burst forth and rival ambitions drenched China in blood, he turned his muse to sadder themes and pictured the human side of war. Last night a government order came to enlist boys who had reached 18. They must help defend the capital. O mother, O children, do not weep so. Shedding such tears will injure you. When tears stop flowing, then bones come through. Nor heaven nor earth has compassion then. Do you know that in Shantung there are 200 counties turned to the desert forlorn? Thousands of villages, farms, covered only with bushes, the thorn. Men are slain like dogs, women driven like hens along. If I had only known how bad is the fate of boys, I would have had my children all girls. Boys are only born to be buried beneath tall grass. Still, the bones of the war dead of long ago are beside the blue sea when you pass. They are wildly white, and they lie exposed on the sand. Both the little young ghosts and the old ghosts gather here to cry in a band. When the rains sweep down in the autumn and winds that chill, their voices are loud, so loud that I learn how grief can kill. Birds make love in their dreams while they drift on the tide. For the dusk's path the fireflies must make their own light. Why should man kill man just in order to live? In vain I sigh in the passing night. For 2 years during the revolutionary interlude he wandered about China, sharing his destitution with his wife and children, so poor that he begged for bread, and so humbled that he knelt to pray for blessings upon the man who took his family and fed them for a while. He was saved by the kindly General Yen Wu, who made him his secretary, put up with his moods and pranks, established him in a cottage by Washing Flower Stream, and required nothing more of him than that he should write poetry. A famous Chinese painting pictures the poet Tu Fu in the thatched cottage. It may be seen at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. He was happy now, and sang blissfully of rain and flowers, mountains, and the moon. Of what use is a phrase or a fine stanza? Before me but mountains, deep forests, too black. I think I shall sell my art objects, my books, and drink just of nature when pure at the source. When a place is so lovely, I walk slow. I long to let loveliness drown in my soul. I like to touch bird feathers. I blow deep into them to find the soft hairs beneath. I like to count stamens, too, and even weigh their pollen gold. The grass is a delight to sit on. I do not need wine here because the flowers intoxicate me so. To the deep of my bones I love old trees and the jade-blue waves of the sea. The good general liked him so that he disturbed his peace, raising him to high office as a censor in Chang'an. Then suddenly the general died. War raged around the poet, and, left only with his genius, he soon found himself penniless again. His children, savage with hunger, sneered at him for his helplessness. He passed into a bitter and lonely old age, an ugly thing now to the eye. The roof of his cabin was torn away by the wind, and urchins robbed him of the straw of his bed while he looked on, too physically weak to resist. Worst of all, he lost his taste for wine, and could no longer solve the problems of life in the fashion of Li Po. At last he turned to religion, and sought solace in Buddhism. Prematurely senile at 59, he made a pilgrimage to the holy Huen Mountain to visit a famous temple. There he was discovered by a magistrate who had read his poetry. The official took the poet home and ordered a banquet to be served in his honor. Hot beef smoked, and sweet wine abounded. Tu Fu had not seen for many years such a feast. He ate hungrily. Then, at his host's request, he tried to compose and sing, but he fell down exhausted. The next day he died. 7. Prose. The abundance of Chinese literature, romances, history, Zuma Qian, essays, Han Yu on the bone of Buddha. The Tang poets are but a part of Chinese poetry, and poetry is a small part of China's literature. It is hard for us to realize the age and abundance of this literature, or its wide circulation among the people. Lack of copyright laws helped other factors to make printing cheap, and it was nothing unusual before the advent of Western ideas to find bound sets of 20 volumes selling new at $1, encyclopedias in 20 volumes selling new at $4, and all the Chinese classics together obtainable for $2. It is harder still for us to appreciate this literature, for the Chinese value form and style far above contents in judging a book, and form and style are betrayed by every translation. The Chinese pardonably consider their literature superior to any other than that of Greece, and perhaps the exception is due to Oriental courtesy. Fiction, through which Occidental authors most readily rise to fame, is not ranked as literature by the Chinese. It hardly existed in China before the Mongols brought it in, and even today the best of Chinese novels are classed by the literati as popular amusements, unworthy of mention in a history of Chinese letters. The simple folk of the cities do not mind these distinctions, but turn without prejudice from the songs of Po Chui and Li Po to the anonymous interminable romances that, like the theater, use the colloquial dialects of the people and bring back to them vividly the dramatic events of their historic past. For almost all the famous novels of China take the form of historical fiction. Few of them aim at realism, and fewer still attempt such psychological or social analysis as lift the Brothers Karamazov and The Magic Mountain, War and Peace and Les Miserables to the level of great literature. One of the earliest Chinese novels is the Shui Hu Chuan, or Tale of the Water Margins, composed by a bevy of authors in the 14th century. It has been well translated by Mrs. Pearl Buck under the title All Men Are Brothers, New York, 1933. One of the vastest is the Hung Lao Men, circa 1650, a 24-volume dream of the Red Chamber. One of the best is the Liao Chai Chi-I, circa 1660, or Strange Stories, much honored for the beauty and terseness of its style. The most famous is the San Kuo Chi Yen-I, or Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a 1,200-page embellishment by Lo Kuan-chung, 1260 to 1341, of the wars and intrigues that followed the fall of the Han. Translated by C.H. Brewitt Taylor, 2 volumes, Shanghai, 1925. These expansive stories correspond to the picaresque novels of 18th century Europe. Often, if one may report mere hearsay in these matters, they combine the jolly portrayal of character of Tom Jones with the lively narrative of Gil Blas. They are recommended to the reader's leisurely old age. The most respectable form of literature in China is history, and of all the accepted forms it is also the most popular. No other nation has had so many historians, certainly no other nation has written such extensive histories. Even the early courts had their official scribes, who chronicled the achievements of their sovereigns and the portents of the time. And this office of court historian, carried down to our own generation, has raised up in China a mass of historical literature unequaled in length or dullness anywhere else on the earth. The 24 official dynastic histories, published in 1747, ran to 219 large volumes. From the Shu Qing, or Book of History, so edifyingly Baudelarized by Confucius, and the Tso Chuan, a commentary written a century later to illustrate and vivify the Book of the Master, and the Annals of the Bamboo Books, found in the tomb of a king of Wei, historiography advanced rapidly in China until, in the 2nd century before Christ, it produced a chef-d'oeuvre in the historical record, painstakingly put together by Zuma Qian. Succeeding to his father as court astrologer, Zuma first reformed the calendar and then devoted his life to a task which his father had begun, of narrating the history of China from the first mythical dynasty to his own day. He had no penchant for beauty of style, but aimed merely to make his record complete. He divided his book into 5 parts. 1. Annals of the Emperors. 2. Chronological tables. 3. 8 chapters on rites, music, the pitch pipes, the calendar, astrology, imperial sacrifices, watercourses, and political economy. 4. Annals of the feudal nobles. And 5. Biographies of eminent men. The whole covered a period of nearly 3,000 years, and took the form of 526,000 Chinese characters, patiently scratched upon bamboo tablets with a style. Then Zuma Qian, having given his life to his book, sent his volumes to his emperor and the world, with this modest preface. Your servant's physical strength is now relaxed. His eyes are short-sighted and dim. Of his teeth but a few remain. His memory is so impaired that the events of the moment are forgotten as he turns away from them, his energies having been wholly exhausted in production of this book. He therefore hopes that your Majesty may pardon his vain attempt for the sake of his loyal intention, and in moments of leisure will deign to cast a sacred glance over this work, so as to learn from the rise and fall of former dynasties the secret of the successes and failures of the present hour. Then, if such knowledge shall be applied for the advantage of the empire, even though your servant may lay his bones in the yellow springs, the aim and ambition of his life will be fulfilled. We shall find none of the brilliance of 10 in the pages of Zuma Tian, no charming gossip and anecdotes in the style of Herodotus, no sober concatenation of cause and effect, as in Thucydides, no continental vision pictured in music, as in Gibbon. For history seldom rises in China from an industry to an art. From Zuma Tian to his namesake Zuma Kuang, who 1100 years later attempted again a universal history of China, the Chinese historians have labored to record faithfully, sometimes at the cost of their income or their lives, the events of a dynasty or a reign. They have spent their energies upon truth, and have left nothing for beauty. Perhaps they were right, and history should be a science rather than an art. Perhaps the facts of the past are obscured when they come to us in the purple of Gibbon or the sermons of Carlyle. But we too have dull historians, and can match any nation in volumes dedicated to record and gather dust. Livelier is the Chinese essay, for here art is not forbidden, and eloquence has loose rein. Famous beyond the rest in this field is the great Han Yu, whose books are so valued that tradition requires the reader to wash his hands in rosewater before touching them. Born among the humblest, Han Yu reached to the highest ranks in the service of the state, and fell from grace only because he protested too intelligibly against the imperial concessions to Buddhism. To Han, the new religion was merely a Hindu superstition, and it offended him to his Confucian soul that the emperor should lend his sanction to the intoxication of his people with this enervating dream. Therefore he submitted in 803 A.D. a memorial to the emperor, from which these lines may serve as an example of Chinese prose discolored even by honest translation. Your servant has now heard that instructions have been issued to the priestly community to proceed to Fengxiang and receive a bone of Buddha, and that from a high tower your majesty will view its introduction into the imperial palace. Also that orders have been sent to the various temples, commanding that the relic be received with the proper ceremonies. Now, foolish though your servant may be, he is well aware that your majesty does not do this in the vain hope of deriving advantages therefrom, but that in the fullness of our present plenty, and in the joy which reigns in the heart of all, there is a desire to fall in with the wishes of the people in the celebration at the capital of this delusive mummery. For how could the wisdom of your majesty stoop to participate in such ridiculous beliefs? Still, the people are slow of perception and easily beguiled, and should they behold your majesty thus earnestly worshipping at the feet of Buddha, they would cry out, "See, the Son of Heaven, the All-Wise, is a fervent believer. Who are we, his people, that we should spare our bodies?" Then would ensue a scorching of heads and burning of fingers. Crowds would collect together, and tearing off their clothes and scattering their money, would spend their time from morn to eve in imitation of your majesty's example. The result would be that by and by, young and old, seized with the same enthusiasm, would totally neglect the business of their lives. And should your majesty not prohibit it, they would be found flocking to the temples, ready to cut off an arm or slice their bodies as an offering to the god. Thus would our traditions and customs be seriously injured, and ourselves become a laughing-stock on the face of the earth. Therefore your servant, overwhelmed with shame for the censors, implores your majesty that these bones be handed over for destruction by fire and water, whereby the root of this great evil may be exterminated for all time, and the people know how much the wisdom of your majesty surpasses that of ordinary men. The glory of such a deed will be beyond all praise. And should the Lord Buddha have power to avenge this insult by the infliction of some misfortune, then let the vials of his wrath be poured out upon the person of your servant, who now calls heaven to witness that he will not repent him of his oath. In a conflict between superstition and philosophy, one may safely wager on the victory of superstition, for the world wisely prefers happiness to wisdom. Han was exiled to a village in Guangdong, where the people were still simple barbarians. He did not complain, but set himself, after the teaching of Confucius, to civilize them with his example, and he succeeded so well that his picture today often bears the legend, "Wherever he passed, he purified." He was finally recalled to the capital, served his state well, and died loaded with honors. His memorial tablet was placed in the temple of Confucius, a place usually reserved for the disciples or greatest exponents of the master, because he had defended the doctrines of Confucianism so recklessly against the invasion of a once noble but now corrupted faith. 8. The stage, its low repute in China, origins, the play, the audience, the actors, music. It is difficult to classify Chinese drama, for it is not recognized by China as either literature or art. Like many other elements of human life, its repute is not proportioned to its popularity. The names of the dramatists are seldom heard, and the actors, though they may give a lifetime to preparation and accomplishment and rise to a hectic fame, are looked upon as members of an inferior order. Something of this odor, no doubt, attached to actors in every civilization, above all in those medieval days when drama was rebelliously differentiating itself from the religious pantomimes that had given it birth. A similar origin is assigned to the Chinese theater. Under the Zhou dynasty, religious ritual included certain dances performed with wands. Tradition says that these dances were later forbidden, on the score that they had become licentious, and it was apparently from this cleavage that secular drama began. Ming Huang, patron of so many arts, helped the development of an independent drama by gathering about him a company of male and female actors whom he called the young folk of the Pear Garden. But it was not till the reign of Kublai Khan that the Chinese theater took on the scope of a national institution. In the year 1031, Kung Tao Fu, a descendant of Confucius, was sent as Chinese envoy to the Mongol Khitans, and was welcomed with a celebration that included a play. The buffoon, however, represented Confucius. Kung Tao Fu walked out in a huff, but when he and other Chinese travelers among the Mongols returned to China, they brought reports of a form of drama more advanced than any that China had yet known. When the Mongols conquered China, they introduced it to both the novel and the theater, and the classic examples of Chinese drama are still the plays that were written under the Mongol sway. The art developed slowly, for neither the church nor the state would support it. For the most part it was practiced by strolling players who set up a platform in some vacant field and performed before a village audience standing under the open sky. Occasionally mandarins engaged actors to perform at private dinner parties, and sometimes a guild would produce a play. Theaters became more numerous during the 19th century, but even at its close there were only 2 in the large city of Nanking. The drama was a mixture of history, poetry, and music. Usually some episode from an historical romance was the center of the plot, or scenes might be played from different dramas on the same evening. There was no limit to the length of the performance. It might be brief or last several days. Ordinarily it took 6 or 7 hours, as with the best of contemporary American plays. There was much swashbuckling and oratory, much violence of blood and speech, but the denouement did its best to atone for reality by making virtue triumph in the end. The drama became an educational and ethical instrument, teaching the people something about their history and inculcating the Confucian virtues, above all filial piety, with a demoralizing regularity. The stage had little furnishing or scenery and no exits. All the actors in the cast, along with their supernumeraries, sat on the stage throughout the play, rising when their roles demanded. Occasionally attendants served them tea. Other functionaries passed about among the audience, selling tobacco, tea, and refreshments, and providing hot towels for the wiping of faces during summer evenings. Drinking, eating, and conversation were now and then interrupted by some exceptionally fine or loud acting on the stage. The actors had often to shout in order to be heard, and they wore masks in order that their roles might be readily understood. As the result of Qianlong's prohibition of woman players, female parts were acted by men, and so well that when women were in our time again admitted to the stage, they had to imitate their imitators in order to succeed. The actors were required to be experts in acrobatics and the dance, for their parts often called for skillful manipulation of the limbs, and almost every action had to be performed according to some ritual of grace, in harmony with the music that accompanied the stage. Gestures were symbolic and had to be precise and true to old conventions. In such accomplished actors as Mei Langfang, the artistry of hands and body constituted half the poetry of the play. It was not completely theater, not quite opera, not predominantly dance. It was a mixture almost medieval in quality, but as perfect in its kind as Palestrina's music or stained glass. Music was seldom an independent art, but belonged as a handmaiden to religion and the stage. Tradition ascribed its origin, like so much else, to the legendary Emperor Fuxi. The Li Qi, or Book of Rites, dating from before Confucius, contained or recorded several treatises on music. And the Zhou Chuan, a century after Confucius, described eloquently the music to which the Odes of Wei were sung. Already, by Kung Fu Tse's time, musical standards were ancient, and innovations were disturbing quiet souls. The sage complained of the lascivious airs that were in his day supplanting the supposedly moral tunes of the past. Greco-Bactrian and Mongolian influences entered and left their mark upon the simple Chinese scale. The Chinese knew of the division of the octave into 12 semitones, but they preferred to write their music in a pentatonic scale, corresponding roughly to our F, G, A, C, and D. To these whole tones they gave the names Emperor, Prime Minister, Subject People, State Affairs, and Picture of the Universe. Harmony was understood, but was seldom used except for tuning instruments. The latter included such wind instruments as flutes, trumpets, oboes, whistles, and gourds, such stringed instruments as viols and lutes, and such percussion instruments as tambourines and drums, bells and gongs, cymbals and castanets, and musical plates of agate or jade. The effects were as weird and startling to an Occidental ear as the sonata appassionata might seem to the Chinese. Nevertheless, they lifted Confucius to a vegetarian ecstasy, and brought to many hearers that escape from the strife of wills and ideas which comes with the surrender to music well composed. The sages, said Han Yu, taught man music in order to dissipate the melancholy of his soul. They agreed with Nietzsche that life without music would be a mistake. Chapter 25. The Age of the Artists. 1. The Sung Renaissance. 1. The Socialism of Wang Anshi. The Sung Dynasty, a radical premier, his cure for unemployment, the regulation of industry, codes of wages and prices, the nationalization of commerce, state insurance against unemployment, poverty, and old age, examinations for public office, the defeat of Wang Anshi. The Tang dynasty never recovered from the revolution of An Lushan. The emperors who followed Ming Huang were unable to restore the imperial authority throughout the empire, and after a century of senile debility the dynasty came to an end. 5 dynasties followed in 53 years, but they were as feeble as they were brief. As always in such cases, a strong and brutal hand was needed to re-establish order. One soldier emerged above the chaos and set up the Sung dynasty, with himself as its first emperor, under the name of Taizu. The bureaucracy of Confucian officials was renewed, examinations for office were resumed, and an attempt was made by an imperial counselor to solve the problems of exploitation and poverty by an almost socialist control over the nation's economic life. Wang Anshi, 1021 to 1086, is one of the many fascinating individuals who enliven the lengthy annals of Chinese history. It is part of the bathos of distance that our long removal from alien scenes obscures variety in places and men, and submerges the most diverse personalities in a dull uniformity of appearance and character. But even in the judgment of his enemies, whose very number distinguished him, Wang stood out as a man different from the rest, absorbed conscientiously in the enterprise of government, devoted recklessly to the welfare of the people, leaving himself no time for the care of his person or his clothes, rivaling the great scholars of his age in learning and style, and fighting with mad courage the rich and powerful conservatives of his age. By a trick of chance, the only great figure in the records of his country who resembled him was his namesake, Wang Mang. Already the turbid stream of history had traveled 1,000 years since China's last outstanding experiment with socialist ideas. On receiving the highest office in the command of the emperor, Wang Anshi laid it down as a general principle that the government must hold itself responsible for the welfare of all its citizens. The state, he said, should take the entire management of commerce, industry, and agriculture into its own hands, with a view to succoring the working classes and preventing them from being ground into the dust by the rich. He began by abolishing the forced labor that had from time immemorial been exacted from the Chinese people by the government, and had often taken men from the fields at the very time when the sowing or the harvesting needed them, and nevertheless he carried out great engineering works for the prevention of floods. He rescued the peasants from the money-lenders who had enslaved them, and lent them, at what were then low rates of interest, funds for the planting of their crops. To the unemployed, he gave free seed and other aid in setting up homesteads, on condition that they would repay the state out of the yield of their land. Boards were appointed in every district to regulate the wages of labor and the prices of the necessaries of life. Commerce was nationalized. The produce of each locality was bought by the government, part of it was stored for future local needs, and the rest was transported to be sold in state depots throughout the realm. A budget system was established, A budget commission submitted proposals and estimates of expenditure, and these estimates were so strictly adhered to in administration that the state was saved considerable sums which had previously fallen into those secret and spacious pockets that crossed the path of every governmental dollar. Pensions were provided for the aged, the unemployed, and the poor. Education and the examination system were reformed. The tests were devised to reveal acquaintance with facts rather than with words, and to shift the emphasis from literary style to the application of Confucian principles to current tasks. The role of formalism and rote memory in the training of children was reduced, and for a time, says a Chinese historian, even the pupils at village schools threw away their textbooks of rhetoric and began to study primers of history, geography, and political economy. Why did this noble experiment fail? First, perhaps because of certain elements in it that were more practical than utopian. Though most of the taxes were taken from the incomes of the rich, part of the heavy revenue needed for the enlarged expenses of the state was secured by appropriating a portion of the produce of every field. Soon the poor joined with the rich in complaining that taxes were too high. Men are always readier to extend governmental functions than to pay for them. Further, Wang Anshi had reduced the standing army as a drain on the resources of the people, but had, as a means of replacing it, decreed the universal liability of every family of more than one male to provide a soldier in time of war. He had presented many families with horses and fodder, but on condition that the animals should be properly cared for and be placed at the service of the government in its military need. When it turned out that invasion and revolution were multiplying the occasions of war, these measures brought Wang Anshi's popularity to a rapid end. Again, he had found it difficult to secure honest men to administer his measures. Corruption spread throughout the mammoth bureaucracy, and China, like many nations since, saw itself faced with the ancient and bitter choice between private plunder and public graft. Conservatives, led by Wang's own brother and by the historian Sima Kuang, denounced the experiment as inherently unsound. They argued that human corruptibility and incompetence made governmental control of industry impracticable, and that the best form of government was a laissez-faire which would rely on the natural economic impulses of men for the production of services and goods. The rich, stung by the high taxation of their fortunes and the monopoly of commerce by the government, poured out their resources in the resolve to discredit the measures of Wang Anshi, to obstruct their enforcement, and to bring them to a disgraceful end. The opposition, well organized, exerted pressure on the emperor, and when a succession of floods and droughts was capped by the appearance of a terrifying comet in the sky, the Son of Heaven dismissed Wang from office, revoked his decrees, and called his enemies to power. Once again, everything was as before. 2. The revival of learning, the growth of scholarship, paper and ink in China, steps in the invention of printing, the oldest book, paper money, movable type, anthologies, dictionaries, encyclopedias. Meanwhile, through all wars and revolutions, through all administrations and experiments, the life of the Chinese people flowed evenly on, not much disturbed by events too distant to be heard of until long since past. The Sung rule was overthrown in the north, but re-established itself in the south. The capital was moved from Pyongyang, now Kaifeng, to Lin'an, now Hangzhou. In the new capital, as in the old, luxury and refinement grew, and traders came from many parts of the world to buy the unmatched products of Chinese industry and art. Emperor Huizong, 1101 to 1125, set the fashion at Pyongyang by being an artist first and a ruler afterward. He painted pictures while the barbarians marched upon his capital, and founded an art academy that stimulated with exhibitions and prizes the arts that were to be the chief claim of the Sung era to the remembrance of mankind. Inspiring collections were made of Chinese bronzes, paintings, manuscripts, and jades. Great libraries were collected, and some of them survived the glories of war. Scholars and artists crowded the northern and southern capitals. It was in this dynasty that printing entered like an imperceptibly completed revolution into the literary life of the Chinese. It had grown step by step through many centuries. Now it was ready in both its phases, blocks to print whole pages, and movable type cast of metal in matrices, as a thoroughly Chinese invention, the greatest after writing in the history of our race. The first step in the development had to be the discovery of some more convenient writing material than the silk or bamboo that had contented the ancient Chinese. Silk was expensive and bamboo was heavy. Moti needed 3 carts to carry with him in his travels the bamboo books that were his chief possession, and Shi Huangti had to go over 120 pounds of state documents every day. About 105 A.D., one Tsai Lun informed the emperor that he had invented a cheaper and lighter writing material made of tree bark, hemp, rags, and fish nets. Tsai was given a high title and office by the emperor, was involved in an intrigue with the empress, was detected, went home, took a bath, combed his hair, put on his best robes, and drank poison. The new art spread rapidly and far, for the oldest existing paper, found by Sir Aurel Stein in a spur of the Great Wall, is in the form of state documents pertaining to occurrences in the years 21 to 137 A.D., and apparently contemporary with the latest of those events. It is dated, therefore, about 150 A.D., only half a century after Tsai Lun's report of his invention. These early papers were of pure rag, essentially like the paper used in our own day when durability is desired. The Chinese developed paper almost to perfection by using a sizing of glue or gelatin and a base of starchy paste to strengthen the fibers and accelerate their absorption of ink. When the art was taught by the Chinese to the Arabs in the 8th century, and by the Arabs to Europe in the 13th, it was already complete. Ink, too, came from the East, for though the Egyptian had made both ink and paper in what might be called the most ancient antiquity, it was from China that Europe learned the trick of mixing it out of lampblack. India ink was originally Chinese. Red ink, made of sulfide of mercury, had been used in China as far back as the Han dynasty. Black ink appeared there in the 4th century, and henceforth the use of red ink was made an imperial privilege. Black ink encouraged printing, for it was especially adapted for use on wooden blocks, and enjoyed almost complete indelibility. Blocks of paper have been found in Central Asia, which had lain under water so long as to become petrified, but the writing, in ink, could still be clearly read. The use of seals in signatures was the unconscious origin of print. The Chinese word for print is still the same as the word for seal. At first these seals, as in the Near East, were impressed upon clay. About the 5th century they were moistened with ink. Meanwhile, in the 2nd century, the text of the classics had been cut in stone, and soon thereafter the custom arose of making inked rubbings from these inscriptions. In the 6th century we find large wooden seals used by the Taoists to print charms. A century later, the Buddhist missionaries experimented with various methods of duplication through seals, rubbings, stencils, and textile prints. The last an art of Indian derivation. The earliest extant block prints are 1,000,000 charms printed in Japan about 770 A.D. in the Sanskrit language and the Chinese character, an excellent instance of cultural interaction in Asia. Many block prints were made during the Tang dynasty, but they were apparently destroyed or lost in the chaos of revolution that followed Ming Huang. In 1907, Sir Aurel Stein persuaded the Taoist priests of Chinese Turkestan to let him examine the Caves of the Thousand Buddhas at Tunhuang. In one of these chambers, which had apparently been walled up about the year 1035 A.D. and not opened again until 1900, lay 1,130 bundles, each containing a dozen or more manuscript rolls. The whole formed a library of 15,000 books, written on paper, and as well preserved as if they had been inscribed the day before their modern discovery. It was among these manuscripts that the world's oldest printed book was found, the Diamond Sutra, a roll ending with these words, printed on, the equivalent of, May 11th, 868, by Wang Jie, for free general distribution, in order in deep reverence to perpetuate the memory of his parents. 3 other printed books were found in the mass of manuscripts. One of them marked a new development, for it was not a roll, like the Diamond Sutra, but a tiny folded book, the first known of its now multitudinous kind. As in late medieval Europe and among primitive peoples in recent times, the first stimulus to printing came from religion, which sought to spread its doctrines by sight as well as sound, and to put its charms and prayers and legends into every hand. Almost as old as these pious forms of print, however, are playing cards, which appeared in China in 969 or sooner, and were introduced from China into Europe near the end of the 14th century. These early volumes had been printed with wooden blocks. In a Chinese letter written about 870 A.D., we find the oldest known mention of such work. Once when I was in Sichuan, I examined in a bookshop a schoolbook printed from wood. Already, it seems, the art of printing had been developed, and it is interesting to observe that this development seems to have come first in western provinces, like Sichuan and Turkestan, which had been prodded onto civilization by Buddhist missionaries from India and had for a time enjoyed a culture independent of the eastern capitals. Block printing was introduced to eastern China early in the 10th century when a prime minister, Feng Tao, persuaded the emperor to provide funds for the printing of the Chinese classics. The work took 20 years and filled 130 volumes, for it included not only the texts but the most famous commentaries. When it was completed, it gave the classics a circulation that contributed vigorously to the revival of learning and the strengthening of Confucianism under the Sung kings. One of the earliest forms of block printing was the manufacture of paper money. Appearing first in Sichuan in the 10th century, it became a favorite occupation of Chinese governments and led within a century to experiments in inflation. In 1294, Persia imitated this new mode of creating wealth. In 1297, Marco Polo described with wonder the respect which the Chinese showed for these curious scraps of paper. It was not till 1656 that Europe learned the trick and issued its first paper currency. Movable type was also a Chinese invention, but the absence of an alphabet and the presence of 40,000 characters in written Chinese made its use an impossible luxury in the Far East. Pi Sheng formed movable type of earthenware as early as 1041 A.D., but little use was found for the invention. In 1403, the Koreans produced the first metal type known to history. Models were engraved in hardwood, molds of porcelain paste were made from these models, and from these molds, baked in an oven, the metal type was cast. The greatest of Korean emperors, Taizong, at once adopted the invention as an aid to government and the preservation of civilization. "Whoever is desirous of governing," said that enlightened monarch, "must have a wide acquaintance with the laws and the classics. Then he will be able to act righteously without, and to maintain an upright character within, and thus to bring peace and order to the land. Our eastern country lies beyond the seas, and the number of books reaching us from China is small. The books printed from blocks are often imperfect, and moreover it is difficult to print in their entirety all the books that exist. I ordain, therefore, that characters be formed of bronze, and that everything without exception upon which I can lay my hands be printed, in order to pass on the tradition of what these works contain. That will be a blessing to us to all eternity. However, the costs shall not be taken from the people in taxes. I and my family and those ministers who so wish will privately bear the expense." From Korea, the casting of movable type spread to Japan and back again to China, but not apparently until after Gutenberg's belated discovery in Europe. In Korea, the use of movable type continued for 2 centuries and then decayed. In China, its use was only occasional until merchants and missionaries from the West, as if returning an ancient gift, brought to the East the methods of European typography. From the days of Feng Tao to those of Li Hongchang, the Chinese clung to block printing as the most feasible form for their language. Despite this limitation, Chinese printers poured out a great mass of books upon the people. Dynastic histories in hundreds of volumes were issued between 994 and 1063. The entire Buddhist canon, in 5,000 volumes, was completed by 972. Writers found themselves armed with a weapon which they had never had before. Their audience was widened from the aristocracy to the middle, even to part of the lower classes. Literature took on a more democratic tinge and a more varied form. The art of block printing was one of the sources of the Sung Renaissance. Stimulated with this liberating invention, Chinese literature now became an unprecedented flood. All the glory of the humanist revival in Italy was anticipated by 200 years. The ancient classics were honored with 100 editions and 1,000 commentaries. The life of the past was captured by scholarly historians and put down for millions of readers in the new marvel of type. Vast anthologies of literature were collected, great dictionaries were compiled, and encyclopedias like mastodons made their way through the land. The first of any moment was that of Wushu, 947 to 1002. For lack of an alphabet, it was arranged under categories, covering chiefly the physical world. In 977 A.D., the Sung Emperor Taizong ordered the compilation of a larger encyclopedia. It ran to 32 volumes and consisted for the most part of selections from 1,690 pre-existing books. Later, under the Ming Emperor Yongle, 1403 to 1425, an encyclopedia was written in 10,000 volumes and proved too expensive to be printed. Of the one copy handed down to posterity, all but 160 volumes were consumed by fire in the Boxer riots of 1900. Never before had scholars so dominated a civilization. 3. The rebirth of philosophy. Chu Shi, Wang Yangming, Beyond Good and Evil. These scholars were not all Confucians, for rival schools of thought had grown up in the course of 15 centuries, and now the intellectual life of the exuberant race was stirred with much argument about it. The seepage of Buddhism into the Chinese soul had reached even the philosophers. Most of them now affected a habit of solitary meditation. Some of them went so far as to scorn Confucius for scorning metaphysics, and to reject his method of approach to the problems of life and mind as too external and crude. Introspection became an accepted method of exploring the universe, and epistemology made its first appearance among the Chinese. Emperors took up Buddhism or Taoism as ways of promoting their popularity or of disciplining the people, and at times it seemed that the reign of Confucius over the Chinese mind was to end. His savior was Chu Shi. Just as Shankara, in 8th century India, had brought into an intellectual system the scattered insights of the Upanishads, and had made the Vedanta philosophy supreme, and just as Aquinas, in 13th century Europe, was soon to weave Aristotle and St. Paul into the victorious scholastic philosophy, so Chu Shi, in 12th century China, took the loose apothegms of Confucius, and built upon them a system of philosophy orderly enough to satisfy the taste of a scholarly age, and strong enough to preserve for 7 centuries the leadership of the Confucians in the political and intellectual life of the Chinese. This book is continued on Cassette 8, Side 1.